Welcome back. So, I was just ending with finishing up number 3, where we were talking about the filioque clause. We didn't talk about this too much in the class, but it is in your textbook, and you read about it for homework. Is the only really sort of theological difference between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, and it's not even really a big deal. It's one clause in the Creed where the Catholic Church says, we believe that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, and the Orthodox Church says, we believe that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. So it's just and I just got a text. Sorry about that. Anyway, it's just a little bit of a different understanding of the Holy Spirit's relationship in the Trinity. Not a big theological deal. It's more of a political schism than it is a theological schism. And nobody's a heretic out of this one. What factors contributed? That's what we just did. Number 4, the barbarian Christians of the Dark Ages were very different from the Roman Christians of the early church, because the barbarian Christians we talked about this a little bit already, but they were very uneducated. They didn't have the Roman tradition of law and philosophy. They were peasants for the most part, whereas the Roman Christians were much more educated, generally much more kind of civilized and sophisticated, we would probably say. And had a greater sense of like law and order and that sort of thing. 5 pillars of Islam, you can read about this in PowerPoint number 3. Right here, they are faith that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. They pray 5 times a day. They fast for a whole month called Ramadan, and they give 2.5% of their income to the poor. They also do a pilgrimage to Mecca at some point in their life. And Shiite Muslims also have jihad as one of their pillars. The 2 main positive impacts of this number 6 of Muslim pressure on Europe for Christians was, 1, it brought much unity to Christendom. In fact, it almost reunited the Catholic and Orthodox Church, except for the Fourth Crusade, which screwed that all up. The second positive impact was that it reintroduced the West to Greek philosophy, specifically Aristotle, who's going to be a big deal because Thomas Aquinas is going to really adopt Aristotle into Christianity, and a lot of theology is going to be changed and kind of formed around Aristotle and expressed in Aristotelian terms, I guess is the best way to say it. 7, changes made to the practice of baptism during the Dark Ages. Infant baptism became much more common. It became the norm. It's a separate rite from confirmation and the other rites of initiation. And 2, public penance becomes private confession. It's the first time we have private confessions for any old sin for any reason, not just big public penance ceremonies where there was public confessions and that sort of thing. Irish monks made it private confession, by the way. They started that practice. Thank you, the Irish. Number 9, the Inquisition was supposed to combat heresy. And it was supposed to not be violent and not use torture, and it was supposed to be all very well-trained priests who would get people to go to confession and then bring them back to the church and not use violence. It was against the law, the church law, for them to use violence. However, they became more involved with, as the Inquisition became more involved with the state, specifically France in the beginning, and later Spain and Italy, things get a little more violent. That's not to excuse the church, but it's also not entirely the church's fault either. The church is neither blameless nor wholly responsible for these crimes. They're complex issues. Nothing is really black and white when it comes to history, for the most part. What was the purpose of the Crusades? How did they start? We'll go back to number 5 again. They started because the Seljuk Turks were pushing further and further west and putting pressure on Constantinople, who calls the Byzantine emperor, asks the Pope for help, and since they just had a schism like 40 years earlier, the Pope's like, hey, this would be awesome, we could help them out, maybe we'd get back together, so he sends the First Crusade, and they take over Jerusalem kind of miraculously, and everyone thinks it's awesome except the group of, there's some massacres and atrocities. They massacre some Jews and Muslims. It's not very good. The Second Crusade, they try to defend what they had gained, and they lost. The Third Crusade, they try to take it back, and they lose. In the Fourth Crusade, they never even get to the Holy Land. They get to Constantinople, and they sack the place, which ends all hope of a Catholic-Orthodox reconciliation. Really, really terrible. The first was the most successful. The major blunders were the massacring of Jews and Muslims and also sacking Constantinople. They weren't that successful overall. All right, we're getting down to the end here. The Council of Ephesus was again, so if you go to Number 2, 3 important councils. So Ephesus was really, it was about Mary, but really was about Jesus and his the relationship of his human and divine nature. Nestorius thought he had 2 separate natures, the man Jesus and the divine Logos, saying like God didn't die, just the man died. But then there was things that the God part of him did that the man didn't do. So it was kind of the split personality of Jesus. So they decided, no, Mary really is Theotokos. She really is the mother of God, because Jesus is one person, not 2. So Nestorianism is condemned. Then we get Chalcedon just a little bit later, who kind of balances out the other side of this. Chalcedon said, oh, well, if he's one person, then, if you have God and man in the same person, then his human nature would really be minimized. So they really underemphasize his, the Monophysites, one nature is what that means, really underemphasize his human nature. So Pope Leo the Great writes a tome in which he very well articulates Jesus' 2 natures, but yet still rejects Nestorianism, and we read one of those for warm-up, which you can find on Edline if you want to read that. So the resolution is that Jesus really is one person, but he does have 2 natures. So monophysitism is condemned, and this is our first schism that we get. It's not a big schism, but it is a schism. The Coptic Church of Egypt splits off, and to this day, they're Monophysites. These are not huge heresies. They are what I call heresies of emphasis, meaning they just kind of emphasize one truth about Jesus a little too much. Nestorians emphasize Jesus' 2 natures a little too much, and Monophysites emphasize Jesus' divine nature too much. There's a lot of people that are Monophysites nowadays and don't really take Jesus' human nature very seriously, including a lot of my freshmen. But a true Orthodox Christianity, and by Orthodox I don't mean the Orthodox Church, I mean Orthodox, like correct teaching of Christianity, is somewhere in between these. Yes, he has 2 natures, but yes, he is really one person. This is one of the mysteries of our faith. All right, in Second Nicaea, we talked about this already with the icons and the debate over whether it's idolatry or not, and so they define what it means to worship God and what it means to respect or venerate people or icons. And again, Chalcedon and Nicaea add a lot to the East-West tension. And there's other stuff going on in the background, like the crowning of Charlemagne, that also adds to that. All right, so let's talk about Saints. Benedict and Scholastica are twin brother and sister. Benedict is generally regarded as the father of Western monasticism. A lot of his ideas about how to run monastery, where Scholastica, she was kind of the brains of the operation. He wrote it down, but both very holy people. Catherine of Siena is the woman who convinced the Pope to come back from Avignon to Rome and ended the Avignon papacy. Kind of started the Great Western Schism, but that wasn't her fault. Very cool woman. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican friar and theologian, maybe the most famous Catholic theologian, and he takes Aristotle and applies it to Christianity and really does a pretty good synthesis of the two. And a lot of our theology to this day is expressed in Aristotelian language because of Aquinas. And most thought philosophers and theologians since him have either been agreeing with him or reacting against him, but he's very important. Francis of Assisi was a middle-class Italian guy who gave up everything he had to start the first mendicant order. I think it was the first. Maybe the Dominicans were first. But one of the first mendicant orders, definitely the most famous, and he served the poor, and he gave up all his possessions, took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and he didn't live in a monastery. They went around and they did active ministry to the poor. That was the main thing they did. Whereas monasteries, it was more about the internal community, not as much about the ministry outside. Although Franciscans certainly have a community also. St. Clare was a noble woman in the town who was very taken with Francis's ideas and started a female order called the Poor Clares. St. Dominic was a preacher, and he founded the Dominicans, another mendicant order who would travel around combating heresy, most notably the Albigensians. Leo the Great, we talked about some already, and Gregory the Great we did too. But if you want to read more about them, you can go to the So What's a Pope lecture, and you can read all about Leo and all about Gregory, and even listen to some Gregorian chant. So I hope you found that helpful. Oh, the essay. Maybe I should go through the main essay. Yeah, I'll do that. In fact, I have the notes here from class today that we went through. Now, again, you get to argue for either good or bad. You could say, yes, the late Middle Ages was a golden age of Christianity, or no, it wasn't. But you get to decide. It's entirely up to you. On the yes side, you could say, yes, it's the height of church power. You could probably also say that was a negative because there was corruption and stuff. But almost everyone was a Christian in Europe, and there were very many devoted Christians and very many devoted religious, and by religious I mean members of religious orders, so lots of priests and nuns and that sort of thing. And there were many good spiritual devotions that developed. The rosary gets popular during this time. Devotion to relics and pilgrimages grow a lot during this time. Eucharistic adoration becomes a thing here. Novenas, the liturgy of the hours, where you pray morning, evening, and night prayer. The Franciscans and Dominicans are around during this time. You got great theologians like Thomas Aquinas, awesome architecture. This is also sometimes called the Age of Cathedral because they have so many awesome Gothic cathedrals and Romanesque cathedrals. But there's also lots of violence and the Inquisition and the abuses during the Crusades, anti-Semitism, persecution of Jews. The relationship with church and state is like this. Church and state are like this, and so that leads to some corruption. You see with the Avignon papacy, with the French king kind of having the Pope in his pocket, and then you see the other side of that also with Gregory VII being able to, kind of control the emperor. So there's that too, and you can think what you want about that. There's also lots of political discord. We have the Western Schism. We have the Eastern Schism, which is still going on. We have the Pornocracy, which is the period of really bad popes in the 900s. And also there's this really legalistic spirituality. And I talk about this in, where is it? Not in this one. It's in number 5. Yeah. There's this really legalistic spirituality where they really focus on fear, where they're very scared of going to hell, and nobody really wants to receive communion because they're so scared of receiving it unworthily. This idea of God as like a king that is far away in a castle and detached and very powerful. So there is kind of this legalistic, guilt-based, fear-based spirituality, which I think some people even still live with today, but it was definitely a big thing back then, and it's going to get us into trouble with the Reformation next unit. So you can argue for good or bad here, and if you can pull in some of the these themes down here, similarities to modern times, you'll notice it says, reflect on how this time period has positively or negatively impacted modern Christianity, so that should be part of your essay. Also, the interaction between Christianity and various cultures, and what issues keep recurring, and one of the main issues that comes up here is the relationship between church and state. So that would be something pretty important to talk about. I'll end with saying that your essay should state a clear thesis, yet you should also show that you understand the other side. All right, and I think that's all I have for you, so good luck.